The Army has now charged Bergdahl with desertion and misbehavior with the enemy, but the White House painted a very different picture last May. As President Obama met with Bergdahl's parents and presented the swap for 5 Taliban commanders as a good news story, CBS's David Martin raised questions that very night.
At some point, Bergdahl will have to explain the circumstances of his capture. When he disappeared in 2009, officials said he had simply wandered off his base by himself without even a weapon.
Joshua Cornelison was the platoon's medic.
He willfully left. He had premeditated, planned out, and left.
Days later, Megyn Kelly had 6 of Bergdahl's platoon members together on the set.
Raise your hand if you think he deserted. Wow. Raise your hand if you have some question about whether he deserted. Wow.
When this week's charges were filed, journalists like NBC's Jim Liklashevsky and ABC's Martha Raddatz were ready. They had already interviewed some of Bergdahl's fellow soldiers.
Josh Corder served with Bergdahl in Afghanistan.
I think that he's very lucky that they're not talking about the firing squad and death penalty for him.
But the celebrating was short-lived. Bergdahl did not want to see his parents, and his fellow soldiers began to go public with their disgust.
He knew what he was doing when he deserted us.
You know, how did the mainstream media do pushing back against that initial White House narrative that this was some kind of returning hero?
They did great. I mean, within 24 hours, they had platoon leaders and members talking about how this guy was potentially a deserter. What shocks me about this entire story was how it was just below the surface. If it was just below the surface, all of the platoon leaders talking about this, how did the White House miss this? How did Susan Rice say that he served honorably and with distinction? How's that possible if the media, it was so easy to find these people to say this?
Washington Post also did a very good job with the story one day later. Now, Chuck Todd at NBC says White House aides considered this swift boating, but the journalists, reference to the John Kerry campaign against John Kerry, journalists quoted these soldiers by name, put them on camera. These were not shadowy sources, and it had nothing to do with a presidential candidate. It had to do with a guy who they felt betrayed them.
Well, of course, and you hear that term, he deserted us. And my experience with all the military people in my family and just my extended friendships in the military, when you ask people why they're always fighting for their buddy. They're there for their buddies, their colleagues in the trenches, and you don't leave them. It's an obvious act of desertion if you leave them. To wander away, I don't think so. But to have these colleagues of his say he left us, it's pretty clear. And I don't know why the White House wouldn't have done a little of its own vetting before they blew this up as some sort of, heroes welcome home, essentially.
Right. Well, this is one case, Juan, where I think the media actually did a pretty aggressive job, and it didn't take very long.
I think we should be an adversarial press, and I thought especially when you saw the 6 of them on Megyn Kelly's show, I think that was a real demonstration to the American people that his colleagues, people with him, and I might say we have lots of deserters, but to desert on the battlefield is another issue, and I think that's critical here. But I must say there's another way to view this story, Howie, from a media perspective, which is I think the White House said we brought one of our soldiers home. And you can interpret that as spin, but I think it's a fact. And if it was my child, no matter what that child had done, but he put on the American uniform and went to fight for our country, he may have problems, may be psychologically unstable, but to bring our soldier home, I think, is a good move.
I agree with you, Juan, that you do bring your people home. I mean, I don't have any argument with that. And I think, but, we're basically saying the media did its job. And, it's not as though that should be.
Nobody's asking for a standing ovation for us.
Yeah, exactly. No, the media did what it's supposed to do.
Interesting footnote. In January, the O'Reilly Factor and Jim Liklashevsky on NBC reported the Army had decided to charge Bergdahl. And I don't know the exact timing, but the Army denied it at the time. And CNN did a mocking story talking about an inflammatory Fox News segment. Well, not looking so inflammatory now.
Well, especially after the report on him that came out, and of course the White House suddenly being mum after wanting to display him with this big press conference that I think the media felt very abused and used by, frankly.
Right, exactly. All right, Nina Easton, Juan Williams, Kathleen Parker, thanks for stopping by this Sunday.